All right. Thank you, everyone who has been able to join us today. This is our second seminar in so it's a bit of an awkward name maybe, but the Vietnam Firm and Labor Markets online seminar series. Our guest today, our speaker today is Sung-Ju Woo, who's currently at the University of Nottingham, just finishing up a postdoc. And then, sorry, even though you just told me about a minute ago, I've already blanked on the name of where you're moving to in Taiwan. So maybe you could give everyone just a quick introduction about that as you kick things off.
Sounds good. And Brian, so I have an hour, right? Or maybe 15 minutes.
Oh yeah. Oh, sorry. Yes. Thank you for that reminder. So I think that the plan is about 45 minutes presentation with just like say, small, clarification questions only. We'll try to sort of hold the Q&A to the 15 minutes at the end.
Sounds good. Yeah. Thank you, Brian, for this amazing opportunity. And so I'm Song. I'm a research fellow in the University of Nottingham, and in September I will join Academia Sinica in Taiwan as a assistant research fellow. And this is my job market paper from last year, titled Foreign Profit Shifting and the Welfare Responses to the U.S. China Trade War, Evidence from Manufacturers in Vietnam. And I should say, so I know we are having discussion later, but happy to take clarifying questions along the way. So I guess at this point, and also for this audience, I don't have to emphasize how trade war has affected Vietnam substantially. But let me still start off with this uh, graph. So this shows that average U.S. import tariffs on export from China and exports from the rest of the world. And as you can see, starting from 2018 to 2020, average import tariffs on Chinese exports imposed by the US increased from 3% to over 20%, while during the same period, the average import tariffs for the rest of the world stayed pretty much the same. And this recent paper by Alfaro and Chor showed that for U.S. import market shares, actually, the Trump tariffs has contributed this reallocation of market shares across countries. On the right-hand side, you can see that uh, China, Chinese U.S. import market share decreased by over 4 percentage points, while several third countries actually gained in their U.S. import market share. And in particular, Vietnam gained the most in terms of U.S. import market, and you can see their import market share increased by around 2 percentage points. All of this has been documented by many recent empirical papers using either bilateral trade flow data or even firm level data from several countries. But what has been less noticed is that if you think about these Trump tariffs and this foreign demand generated by the tariffs on specific third countries, actually this could also reallocate the market shares within those third countries toward more productive firms. Just think about a typical intuition from the Melitz model, where if you have a foreign demand shock, then this would reallocate market shares toward more productive firms. And if we think about this kind of effect in developing countries, actually one distinctive nature is that most of the productive firms in developing countries are often foreign owned. And therefore, when we think about this selection into participation into trade, then we have to think about this relocation effect away from domestic firms into foreign firms. And that's certainly the case in the country I'm studying in this paper, which is Vietnam. So just to give you a quick overview of this paper studies the welfare implication of the U.S.-China trade war in Vietnam. And the first part of the paper is an empirical analysis of how Vietnam responds to the U.S.-China trade war. Uh, at the trade level, I use bilateral trade flows and look at how Vietnamese import and exports responds to the Trump tariffs. I find strong import and export response from Vietnam. And in particular, the import response is stronger in intermediates import from China, and the export response is stronger in final goods export to the US. So this is suggestive of firms in Vietnam importing cheap intermediates from China, hiring workers to assemble them, and then export the final goods to the world market. In the second part, I use Vietnam Enterprise Survey to look at how Vietnamese manufacturers respond to exposure to Trump tariffs in employment, assets, and exports. What I find is that consistent with the trade level response, Vietnamese manufacturers exhibited positive uh, response in production, but these responses are mainly driven by foreign-owned firms in Vietnam. So motivated by these empirical findings, in the second part of my paper, I use a quantitative trade model to quantify the welfare gains in Vietnam. And there are two main key features of my model. So the first part is that the firms in my model make two decisions. They decide whether to source their inputs from abroad and whether to export the final goods to the world market. And with the specification of my model, there's complementarity between these two margins. So when you have this foreign demand shock, firms not only decide to participate in the world market, but also they are more likely to start sourcing their inputs from abroad. The second part is that I introduce foreign ownership into the model. So firms are distinguished by either domestic or foreign-owned firms, and they differ in their uh, operation costs to become active in production, and also the fixed costs to participate in sourcing and exporting activities. And all these costs I estimate by simulating method of moments, and I show that foreign-owned firms indeed have much lower fixed costs to participate in sourcing and exporting activities. And lastly, with the model, I estimate a foreign demand shock that's in the same magnitude as what I see from the data. Then the baseline number is that I find such shock increase Vietnam's real expenditure by 5%. So I think my paper makes two main contributions to the literature. So first, building upon recent empirical papers looking at how the trade war affected third country response, I find similar effects. And also, in particular, I highlight the source of Vietnam's response to the trade war is mainly coming from foreign-owned manufacturers. And also, my paper provides one of the first welfare quantifications of how a foreign demand shock or how the U.S. China trade war affected Vietnam. And I think this framework is also applicable to study any other foreign demand shock, taking into account the role of foreign ownership. And a quickly um, introduction to the related literature. So here, of course, my paper contributes to the impact of U.S.-China trade war on third countries, as I already mentioned before. But also, I want to emphasize that my paper also relates to this literature on the role of trade and resource reallocation in developing countries, like the work by Brian and co-authors. They show that the U.S.-Vietnam bilateral trade agreement encouraged foreign entry into Vietnam. And here, my paper also showed that the U.S.-China trade war also contributes to foreign foreign entry into Vietnam and also resource reallocation away from domestic firms to foreign-owned firms. Okay, so now let me start off with the empirical analysis. Quickly mention the data. So the main data source is the Vietnam Enterprise Survey. So it's standard firm balance sheet information, and I couple that with Vietnam's technology and competitive survey, and also bilateral trade flow data from CEPII. And I just want to highlight that a very important information that I have from Vietnam Enterprise surveys that I can see the capital source country of the firms. So I can tell whether they are domestic owned or foreign owned, and even the countries they are coming from. So now I want to show you several key descriptive facts of manufacturers in Vietnam. And the first fact I want to show you is the size distribution of Vietnamese manufacturers by ownership. In this figure, you can see that on the x-axis, I'm showing you employment percentile across all Vietnamese manufacturers in 2017, which is 1 year before the U.S. China trade war. And on the y-axis, I'm showing you the share of domestic and foreign-owned manufacturers in each of these percentile. The red bars here, as you can see, scaled to the right is the share of foreign firms in each of these size percentile, and the blue bars are the share of domestic-owned manufacturers. So unsurprisingly, foreign-owned firms are scaled to the right, which means they are much larger than their domestic counterparts. But what's more surprising is the second fact. Sorry. Oh, okay. I see Brian
Yeah,
raise his
sorry, just
hand.
one quick clarifying. When you're talking about domestic, are you including both the domestic private firms as well as state, or just the domestic private firms?
So here, I think I'm only showing the domestic private firms. Yeah. And the foreign-owned firms here in my paper are the 100% foreign-owned firms, which means the greenfield FDI. Yeah. So as I mentioned, the second fact that I think is more interesting is that the trade participation patterns of Vietnamese manufacturers. Here on the x-axis, I'm again showing you employment percentiles for all Vietnamese manufacturers. And on the y-axis, I'm showing you the share of exporters and importers separately by ownership. And here you can see the thicker lines on the top are the share of importers and exporters for foreign-owned manufacturers. And the thinner lines that's very close to zero until the very end is the share of importers and exporters for domestic firms. And here, so what I want to emphasize is that even when you condition on firm size, you can still see that foreign-owned manufacturers have much higher tendency to participate in import and export activities. And this is the kind of variation in the data that helps me to identify the fixed cost of sourcing and exporting separately by ownership. The last descriptive fact that I want to show you is the employment change during the trade war period. So here I'm showing you the employment change between 2017 and 2019 separately by each of the manufacturing subcategories. And here I'm ordered by the share, the employment in 2017. So the largest manufacturing subsectors in Vietnam are apparel, leather, and then computer electronic. And you can see that from 2017 to 2019, actually, there's a large increase in employment in apparel and leather sector, and that increase is predominantly accounted by foreign-owned manufacturers. Okay, so now let me get into the empirical analysis of the Trump tariffs. And here, the first thing I do is I use bilateral trade flow data to look at how Vietnamese imports and exports responds to Trump tariffs. So here on the left-hand side, I have the change in log imports or exports between Vietnam and country K for product P. On the right-hand side, I have the change in log tariffs. So the first tariff is the U.S. tariffs on Chinese exports, which is the Trump tariffs. And then I also control for the retaliatory tariffs. So the Chinese tariffs on U.S. exports and also the direct change in U.S. import tariffs on Vietnamese exports. I have to control that because even if there's a very minimal change between 2017 and 2019, still Trump imposed steel and aluminum tariffs on all the countries. So that's something that I control for. And lastly, to account for potential pre-trends for the each of these products before the trade war, I control for the same outcome between 2013 and 2015 on the right-hand side. And the key coefficient I'm going to show you is this beta one, which captures the trade elasticity with respect to Trump tariffs. So the first outcome I look at is Vietnam's export growth in 2017 to 2019. On the left panel here, I show you the overall Vietnamese exports. So across all products, the first black dot here is the total Vietnamese exports, followed by Vietnamese exports to the U.S., to China, and then the rest of the world. So consistent with recent empirical findings, Vietnamese products exhibited overall positive export response. And the response is positive response can also be seen from exports to the US and to the rest of the world. And on the right panel, I separate the products into final goods. Then I see that this positive response is mainly driven by Vietnam's final goods exports to the US, which is the blue dot on the right panel. And for the magnitude, so here I'm showing you the beta one, which is the regression coefficient. And since one standard deviation increase in this Trump tariffs is around 0.08, this magnitude, for example, the 1.22 on the right panel suggests around 10% increase in Vietnamese exports of final goods to the US. The second outcome I look at is the import growth. Again, on the left panel, I look at overall Vietnamese imports from across all destinations, and then imports from the US, from China, and then the rest of the world. And here, clearly, you can see that the positive Vietnamese import growth is actually mainly coming from imports from China. And then on the right-hand side, I separate products into final goods and intermediates. Then I see that this positive response is mainly driven by imports of intermediates from China. Okay. So the second part, I want to look at Vietnam's production response for manufacturers. And here I use a very similar empirical specification with the Vietnamese Enterprise Survey. So on the left-hand side, I have my outcomes of interest, which are employment and export sales. And I take the log for each of these outcomes between 2017 and 2019. And on the right-hand side, I have so here I have the sectoral exposure to Trump tariffs, to the retaliatory tariffs, and also the direct exposure to the US import tariffs. And here I should emphasize that, so here I actually aggregate the firm level data to the province and sector level. And the reason I'm doing this is to account for potential entrants during this period. And as we as we already know from recent empirical findings, actually, since the Trump trade war, actually a lot of new foreign firms enter Vietnam, and so that's why here I use this. I aggregate the firm level data to the region and sector level to account for both the intensive and extensive margins of these response. So next I'm going to show you the key coefficient beta 1, which again captures the production response with respect to Trump tariffs. So first, in terms of employment, so here I'm showing you the overall response for all manufacturers and then separately by domestic owned and foreign owned manufacturers. And here you can see that overall the employment response is insignificant, but when I separate into different ownership types, then I actually find positive employment response mainly coming from foreign owned manufacturers. And again, this tariff exposure has one standard deviation around 0.07. So this suggests an increase of employment response of around 7%. The second outcome I look at is assets. So here again, I see that most of the positive response is coming from foreign-owned manufacturers. And I also look at export growth. So here you can see that overall, actually, the coefficient is positive, but again, it's stronger and significant for foreign-owned manufacturers. So let me wrap up the empirical findings. At the product level, I see that Vietnamese products exhibited strong export response in final goods to the US and the rest of the world, and also strong import response in intermediates import from China. So I think this is suggestive of Vietnamese manufacturers assemble inputs and then export to the world market. Then at the firm level, I look at how Vietnamese manufacturers responds to exposures to the Trump tariffs, then I find that this exposure actually lead to positive employment and exports growth for foreign-owned manufacturers in Vietnam. And there's little and even negative response from domestic-owned manufacturers. And so if you want to think about how this foreign demand shock benefit Vietnam, actually you have to really consider this ownership aspects. And the last part I want to highlight is that there's really this issue in every empirical study is that all these estimated effects that I show you here are all relative. So here for the product level analysis, I'm comparing products they are affected by Trump tariffs to products that are less affected or not affected by Trump tariffs. And for the firm level analysis, I'm comparing firms that are more exposed to Trump tariffs versus firms that are less exposed. And if you think about this foreign demand shock to Vietnam, actually, there could very well be a general equilibrium effect, and especially in terms of wages. When firms are demanding more workers to respond to the foreign demand shock, this would drive overall wage growth, which has been already highlighted by some recent empirical papers. And this would affect all the firms, no matter which sector you're in. And therefore, to correctly quantify the overall welfare gains, you will need a model to take into account this missing intercept problem. Okay, so that motivates me to develop a quantitative trade model to quantify the welfare gains. And Let me just quickly highlight the key features of my model because I might not have the time to go over all the details today. But this model actually builds upon the global sourcing model by Antrasford and Tintanos paper in 2017. And I introduced several new features into the model. So the first part is that the final goods producers in my model make two decisions. They decide whether to source their inputs from abroad and whether to export their final goods to the world market. And with the specification, I allow for complementarity between these two margins. Second, I allow for foreign ownership into the model, so final goods producers can be either domestic or foreign owned. And they have, depending on the ownership, they have different fixed operation costs. So that's the cost they have to pay to become active in production. And this would lead to different productivity distribution for domestic and foreign owned firms. Second, I allowed different fixed costs of sourcing and exporting for domestic and foreign owned firms, which would lead to different trade participation patterns. Lastly, this is an assumption that I make. So I assume that foreign owned firms do not contribute any profits to domestic consumption in Vietnam. And this allows me to study the welfare implication of profit repatriation. Although I do not have direct empirical evidence on this, but there has been a lot of anecdotes that foreign-owned firms in Vietnam pay very little to not to zero income tax. And so I think this is a reasonable assumption to make. So now let me introduce the environment of the model. On the demand side, it's a very standard CES demand system. So consumers value manufacturing varieties with elasticity sigma. And there's intermediates producers who use only labor as inputs and engage in perfect competition. And their productivity is assumed to be distributed for shed with dispersion theta. So on the input side, it's a very standard Eaton-Corton type of specification. And then the final goods producers, they are, I already mentioned that they are distinguished by either domestic or foreign owned, and they use labor and also a continuum of intermediates as inputs, and they engage in monopolistic competition. To engage in production, they have to pay this ownership specific um, uh, fixed costs and also ownership specific fixed costs to sourcing and exporting. And lastly, to source inputs and export goods to the world market, they have to pay the associated iceberg trade costs. So the demand part is very standard, so let me actually skip this part and jump straight into the production part. So here you can see that final goods producer, they are distinguished by their productivity theta, which follows a certain distribution. And here their marginal cost is consisted of wage, so W sub H, and also a continuum of intermediate inputs, Z. And this is inverse to their own production phi. As you can see here, I have everything has an index of I, which is distinguished by either D or F. So that's their ownership type. So they can be distinguished by either domestic or foreign owned. And the price of this input here, so this Z, would vary by whether you source the inputs domestically or from the world market. So if you decide to source your inputs from abroad, so that's the indicator here. I'm showing you J superscript n. So that's an indicator of whether you decide to source your inputs from abroad. So if you participate uh, in sourcing activities from abroad, then you can choose from the input price from abroad or from the domestic market. Okay, and let me jump straight into the most important part, which is the profit function for the firms. And here, the variable profit function actually has three main components. The first part is the TFP terms. So if you intuitively, if you are more productive, then you will have higher variable profits. That's the first part. And the second part concerns the sourcing decisions. So here you can see that there's big theta from big theta M sub H. That's your sourcing components from the domestic market. And then if you decide to participate in import activities, then you will have this additional component, which is big theta sub A. So that's the component that will drive down your marginal cost. And lastly, there's the demand part. And this is, again, if you participate in export activities, then you will have this indicator J sub superscript X, which indicates whether you participate in export activities. And if that equals 1, then you'll have this additional foreign demand term, which is big theta superscript X. And then the net profit is just the variable profits subtracting the fixed cost you have to pay. So here, if you participate in sourcing and exporting activities, then you will have to pay the associated fixed costs of sourcing and exporting. Again, there's a subscript I here. So depending on whether you are domestic or foreign-owned firms, you could have different fixed costs. And here is just a proposition from my paper. I show that actually the profit function exhibit increasing differences in productivity and sourcing decisions, productivity and exporting decisions, and the sourcing and exporting decisions themselves. And intuitively, this just means that there's complementarity between these two decisions. And when you participate in exporting activities, actually, it's also more profitable for you to participate in sourcing activities. Let me skip the equilibrium conditions and just jump straight into the estimation part. So here, the key parameters that I'm going to show you are the fixed operation costs separated by ownership, sourcing fixed costs separated by ownership, and exporting fixed costs. And all of these parameters I estimate by simulated method of moments. And the key moments are the size distributions of firms and the trade participation patterns separated by domestic and foreign-owned firms. Again, the key identification, the key data variation that allows me to identify these parameters is coming from the fact that foreign-owned firms have much higher trade participation patterns, even when we conditional on firm size. Okay, so now let me show you the parameter estimates. So first, this is the fixed operation costs. So here you can see that foreign-owned firms have much higher fixed operation costs than domestic firms. And this would induce a positive selection in the sense that the foreign-owned firms that are active will be much more productive than their domestic counterparts. And the second part is the fixed cost of sourcing and exporting. So here I'm showing you the median value for all firms, domestic and foreign-owned firms. And here you can see that, uh, not surprisingly, foreign-owned firms have much lower fixed costs of sourcing and exporting, uh, especially for the fixed costs of exporting. Actually, um, the foreign firms have only the median values are around 35,000 US dollars, while the domestic firms, their median fixed cost of exporting is 600,000 US dollars. And now let me show you maybe the most important part of the paper, which is quantifying the welfare gains from Trump tariffs. And here, what I do is, if you remember from the profit function, there's a component that represents the foreign demand for manufacturers. And here, basically what I do is I increase this foreign demand term such that the overall export response is the same as what I identified from the empirical analysis. And it turns out that that will correspond to around 1% increase in this foreign demand term. And what I find is that real expenditure in response increased by 5%. So that's the baseline welfare number I have. And also, um, in response to this increasing foreign demand, firms also increase their labor demand, and this drives up the equilibrium real wage by 6%. And because for the firms that don't participate in exporting activities, they would suffer from this increasing labor demand, and some of them, the unproductive ones, would leave the exit the market, and this drives down number of active firms in equilibrium and increase the average productivity. And here I'm showing you how the sales and export growth and also wage bill growth across all the firms in my model. So here you can see that consistent with this like Melit's type model intuition, this foreign demand shock actually would contribute to firm growth only for the very large ones. Well, most of firms actually they suffer from this increasing domestic wages. So again, you can think about uh, this welfare gains coming from this reallocation of resources away from unproductive firms to productive firms. And lastly, what I did is I do a decomposition exercise to understand um, what's the role of heterogeneity in productivity and heterogeneity in fixed costs in driving the different trade participation patterns. So here on the left panel, I have the import share of importers and exporters in the data in 2019 and my model baseline versus the counterfactuals when I shut down the differences in productivity, differences in fixed costs, and then taking them out altogether. As you can see, so of course, because this is a key moment that I have to match, so the model baseline will be very close to the data in 2019. But then when I shut down heterogeneity in productivity and fixed costs, then I can decompose the role of productivity heterogeneity and fixed cost heterogeneity in driving the response. And just to quickly show you the number, actually, I find the heterogeneity in productivity can only explain around 10% in the differences in trade response between domestic and foreign-owned firms, Well, the differences in fixed costs actually can explain about 40% in the difference in their trade participation patterns. And this highlights in the importance of taking into account heterogeneity in fixed costs in explaining all these trade participation patterns. Okay, so let me conclude this paper. So my paper studies the Vietnam's trade and production response to the U.S.-China trade war. Uh, at the product level, I find that Vietnam exhibited positive import and export response to Trump tariffs. And the import response is particularly strong in input sourcing, especially from China. And the export response is particularly strong in final goods exports to the US. And at the firm level, I find that actually it is the foreign-owned firms that is driving these production, positive production and trade response. Motivated by these empirical findings, then I develop a quantitative trade model to quantify the welfare gains in Vietnam. And I highlight that the fixed cost is crucial to explain the discrepancies in trade participation patterns. And I find this welfare gains are actually mainly driven by this equilibrium increase in real wage growth. And I think this the framework that I developed would be also applicable to study other type of trade episodes that involves substantial presence of foreign ownership. And I think this is something that's particularly relevant in a developing country setting. This is, if you are interested, you can check more details in my paper, and I'm happy to take more questions and feedbacks.
Great. Thanks a lot, Sung. Well done in terms of timing. That was great. I do see lots of very knowledgeable people about the context online. And again, thank you everyone for joining us. I know for some of you this is very early, for some of you this is very late. But we have about 15 minutes open Q&A now, and so I'll just leave it to the floor. Maybe just either raise your hand in real life with your video on, or the online hand. And Sung, I'll just let you sort of grab the question.
Sounds good. So I see there's please feel free to mute yourself.
Hi, yeah. Hi, Sung. It's a great presentation. It's a really interesting paper.
Thank you.
I just basically have two questions. So one is about clarification. So for the slide 28, which is like the last figure that you show, what is it trying to match facts three? Like I understand that you don't target. There's some moments here that you didn't target, and it seemed like the model matched the data really well. I just don't know what exactly is that moment. And then the second question is, it seemed like, maybe you can correct me, I don't see how the reduced form analysis is replicated in the model, or is it used at all? Like once you go to the model, like the reduced form in the sense that how do you see the growth, the changes due to the tariffs? It seemed like you just use facts 1 to 3 in some way, but I feel like in your model, you can actually back out the elasticity of employment with respect to changes in tariffs, right? I mean, it sounds like it's potentially, you could do that, and it's potentially is either a external, matching thing to test, or whether it can be used to discipline the model in some way. So you can tell me where that might fit in, but I'm just like a little bit, I don't see where the connection is right now. So.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you for the question. So the first is about this figure, right? So here, actually, this is what I want to do here is to understand how differences in productivity and differences in fixed costs contribute to the different trade participation patterns between domestic and foreign-owned firms. And so here, because the share of importers and exporters are, of course, the moments that I match on. So So it's not surprising that they are similar to my model. But here, what I'm interested in is how this would be different when I shut down the differences in productivity and when I shut down the differences in fixed costs. And so yeah, so that's how I account for the importance of productivity and fixed costs in driving the trade participation patterns. And then the second question is about the whether I use the reduced form analysis in my estimation. So the answer is no. So actually like you said, the key moments that I use are actually the size distribution and also of manufacturers. Actually, I use year 2017, so that's 1 year before the trade war. I use like size distribution, share of importers, exporters separately by ownership, and to estimate the parameters. There are some other moments, but those are the most important ones. And so what I use mainly from the reduced form is when I impose the when I do the counterfactual exercise, the magnitude of the foreign demand shock actually is I impose the foreign demand shock such that it match the reduced form response. So the overall export growth that I estimated from the reduced form exercise. Yeah. So basically I use that to for my counterfactual. Yeah. Yes.
Hi, hi, Sung. Thank you for your presentation. It's a very nice model, and I think it's very interesting result. I just have a question along the line that Nguyen has mentioned. So I also want to wonder if about identification a little bit. So I wonder if you in first from reduce form part, I wonder if you can look at the response of on the entry margin, like FDI entry in response to the U.S. China tariffs. And I wonder if that could have a little bit, but and that relates to second question that in your model is already a very nice model and quite complicated already. But I wonder if you have a entry margin in that, and so I know you use a share for identification, but I wonder would that you know if you have the entry margin into that, would you be able to identify fixed cost of entry, something like that, for separately for FDI versus domestic firm, using reduced form analysis. I don't know how that. I mean, this is already a nice model and complicated already, so I don't know if that would gonna be happening or because the shares seem like capture a lot of things. So I don't know if adding the fixed cost of entry would add anything to the counterfactual, but I'm just wonder if that is important or not. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. And uh in some way, I think this is something that maybe I would say my model failed to capture. So I do have fixed costs of operation, which means that this is something that the firms in my model have to pay to become active in production. But actually, I assume fixed entry in the sense that the number of potential entrants, the measure of potential entrants is fixed. And the reason why I make that modeling choice is because if you assume just like Manlis, if you assume free entry, then in equilibrium there will be no zero aggregate profits, and therefore there's because one of my motivation to think about when I use the model is to think about the role of profits. And if you assume free entry, then in aggregate, there's no positive profits, and therefore you cannot think about any of these implications. And however, I have to say, actually, it turned out that profits are not a very important contribute. They don't really contribute much to the welfare gains, and the welfare gains are mainly coming from increasing wages. And um, so that's how I think about this right now. And I should say also, in my model, actually the foreign demand shock would induce less number of firms in equilibrium. Well, if you look at the data, actually, this since 2018, there's a large uh, number of entrants, especially firms from China entering into Vietnam. So this is something that that's hard to, well, I guess not explained by my model. Well, if you think about the my companion paper that talks about trade rerouting, actually it's not clear whether uh, so we actually we know that some of these firms their motivation to enter Vietnam is not to do actual production but to do rerouting activities. So that's something also my model cannot explain. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I know, using the labor margin and I think the explanation regarding the profit would be quite convincing. So you don't have to, worry as much about entry that capture a lot of welfare. Um, Thank you.
So thank you. Yeah.
Any other questions from the audience? If not, I'm happy to lob some, but like to keep the floor open first. Okay, don't see anyone unmuting, so yeah, I maybe we'll just go ahead. I do have a couple questions about the model. First, I would like to sort of reiterate the previous question that I do think the entry margin here is important. I know that it makes, well, I don't personally know, but having read some papers in literature, I know that it makes the modeling a lot more complicated to add like a foreign entry decision. But I can't help but think that, even if some of it is rerouting, I would be surprised if that's not some role here. So I would encourage you, if you can, to open up that dimension of the model a bit. But some other concerns I had about the model was I was really surprised by if I wrote it down right, I think 6% increase in real wages for a 1% increase in foreign demand. And I'm wondering if part of that is, if I understood your model, and again, I know it went kind of quick, so maybe I just missed this, but I think it's basically like a closed manufacturing sector, right? Like there's no movement of workers from like the informal sector or from agriculture coming into the manufacturing sector, right? Okay. And in other contexts, like I think, one of the papers you cited, like Lorenzo's work, I think, they're looking at shifts in the structure of the workforce and are finding that, workers are shifting out of other sectors. Some of my earlier work for the BTA, which I know is much older, but also sort of shows workers, shifting across sectors. So I do wonder what the wage results would look like if, for example, your model either had, sort of like at the extreme, you could have an outside sector that just pins down the wages and shut that down, right? Which I don't think that's ideal. But maybe you could have some sort of outside sector with some mobility costs. But again, then that probably requires you to pull in a whole bunch of additional data to try to estimate those mobility costs. But I think Neum has done some work on mobility costs. Maybe even Bob has as well before too. So maybe there might be existing papers where you could just sort of lean on them a little bit to think about what the mobility cost looks like. Ian Coxhead also has done a lot of work on migration within Vietnam. So maybe there's other stuff that you can sort of lean on. So so those are kind of open questions. I was wondering if you've thought about sort of opening the model, at least in that dimension, because the wage growth does seem very high to me. But
Sorry, so just to make sure I understand you, so you feel like the wage growth is the number seems too large to
that's my very just like, not very structurally informed perspective that, there's a 1% increase in foreign demand from the US, and then that generates a 5% increase or 6%, sorry, whichever it was, increase in real wages. Just given sort of like the aggregate context of how important exports to the US are, it is the most important export market, but it's around like what I think like 24-25% of value in total exports. So thinking that increases by 1%, that then drives a 5% increase in wages, where manufacturing I think is like 25% of employment, and exports to the US are 1/4 of total manufacturing exports. So it's hard in aggregate to think about how, at least for me, to think how about a 1% shock to 25% of exports of a sector that's 20% or 25% of total employment increases wages by 5%. Does that make sense?
Right. Yes, but also, yeah, I get this. I actually get these questions quite a lot, but so that's something I'm also checking now. So actually the welfare numbers could also vary when I vary the assumption of what's the percentage of retained I mean the profits that are retained, foreign profits that are retained in Vietnam. But still, I think if you think about, so my model is essentially a two country model, so it's just Vietnam and the world and the rest of the world. And here actually the moment I'm matching on is this overall export growth. So in that sense, I'm not just thinking about the foreign demand from the US, but also from across all markets. Yeah. And then the entry margin, I agree it's something very it's something important, and I'm just not sure if it's yeah, if I should like change the model substantially to allow for that margin. And also I should also emphasize that it's also so there's also no sector heterogeneity in my model, so it's just final goods producer, they decide whether to source their inputs. And so if you are wondering about like sector heterogeneity, that's also something that that's not captured from my model. Yeah.
Okay, I do see that we're just about at our hour of time. I don't know, so I'll probably basically stop the recording now.